just going to get started in a second. Can everybody hear me? Just always to check in the beginning. Cool. Okay. So for anybody new, I just like that everybody keeps their mics muted, just, for the sake of time. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat. If I have some time, I'll ask you to unmute. Janelle is also here. She's a tutor, so she's going to be standby. If she sees any questions in the chat, she can also help you out with that. So we can get started. Today, we're going to be talking about development and aging. My name is Chris. And this is just a quick consent audio and video recording release that we're going to be doing in the beginning of our lectures. It's basically just stating that these lectures are going to be recorded and they're going to be put on YouTube. So it may be a good idea to remove any identifying information from your account. So if you want to remove your last name or a profile picture from your account, you should do so now. But continuing with the lecture, you're just acknowledging and agreeing to this release. And again, if you have any questions, you can let us know, put them in the chat box, anything like that. Okay, and then just a regular introduction. This is the 15-week MCAT course. I put the GroupMe link there. We have our Instagram handle there as well. All of these lectures will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so you can access our channel from that link as well. And just a little bit about the course. We have 3 lectures a week. We do them Thursday, Friday, and Saturday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. And on Sunday, we have unstructured office hours where you can come and ask any questions. If you have any questions about the material that we went over that week, we have 2 tutors that do office hours 2 times a week at 8:30 Eastern time on Sunday. So you can definitely bring the questions there as well. Okay, so with that, we are going to begin the content. So we're going to start with a brief review of embryogenesis and birth. If you guys have been following us from the beginning, Janelle did go over this in her reproduction lecture, but I thought it was pretty pertinent to what we're learning today. So I wanted to start from conception, and then we're going to go from there. So I just want to make sure everybody understands these concepts as well, because they're pretty important for the MCAT. So as you guys should know, the zygote is the first product that's formed after fertilization. It's the diploid cell that results from fertilization, and it enters cleavage about 36 hours after. So cleavage is just the splitting of the zygote into multiple cells. It becomes what is known as the morula. So the zygote and the morula are the same size, even though the morula has gone through multiple rounds of cell division. So this first stage, the zygote really is just trying to divide. It doesn't spend a lot of time in interphase. In fact, I'm not even sure if it enters interphase at all. It's just constantly dividing. It's not making more cytoplasm. It's not making more, it's not going through these normal metabolic processes that somatic cells will. It's just dividing. So that's why we see a division of cell, but we don't see an increase in volume because it's really just trying to proliferate. So next, the morula becomes what we call a blastocyst in a process known as blastulation. So blastulation occurs as the morula continues to divide. The trophoblast develops around a cavity known as the blastocele, and the inner cell mass forms at one end of the trophoblast. So if you look at the bottom over here, we have the morula, which is present at about 4 to 5 days. And then at that 6th day, the cells start to differentiate a little bit more, and it creates what we call a blastocyst. So you see these cells surrounding the blastocyst. Those are the trophoblast cells. These lighter cells over here that are stuck to one side are known as the inner cell mass. And this empty space right over here is a fluid-filled cavity, and we call that the blastocele. So the inner cell mass will eventually become the embryo. The trophoblasts, which remember are these cells that are outside, will become the chorion. And the chorion is just a structure that eventually becomes the placenta. And as we know, the placenta aids in gas and nutrient exchange between the fetus and the mother. Okay. And then the next stage is called gastrulation. So the blastocyst turns into a gastrula, and this occurs about a week after fertilization. So at this point, the blastocyst is going to implant into the endometrium, and that's when gastrulation begins. So this is really where differentiation starts to take off. This is when the germ layers, they give rise, the inner cell mass gives rise to a structure known as the embryonic disc. which actually comes before the germ layers, and then the embryonic disc turns into these three. So we did go over this, like I said, in Janelle's lectures, but I just wanted to touch upon it briefly. So I put this chart down here if you guys want to come back to it. It's a great study resource. The ectoderm is responsible for the epidermis, the central nervous system, and all of the neural crest derivatives. So most of your nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, melanocytes, facial cartilage, dentin of teeth, skull bones, the ectoderm. So some mnemonics that I have come across when I was studying, I've heard of the ectoderm referred to as the attractoderm. So they call it the attractoderm because it's, potentially it gives rise to cells that we would find attractive in someone. So someone has nice skin, nails, eyes. It gives rise to all of those tissues and all of those cells. So if it helps you by remembering the ectoderm is the attractoderm, you can definitely think of it like that. The mesoderm, meso meaning middle, gives rise to bones, cartilage, tendons, muscle, smooth and striated circulatory system, the lymphatic system, the gonads, kidney, adipose tissue, and the notochord. So the mesoderm, the mnemonic that I remember for the mesoderm is that it's the means of movement. So the mesoderm usually gives rise to, bones and muscle, things that help us move. Your circulatory system is moving blood around your body. The lymphatic system is moving stuff around your body. The gonads, if you think about it more, abstractly, the gonads are helping you move through time. So reproduction helps you move through time. Muscle and skeletal tissue help you move physically. So the mesoderm is the means of movement. And the endoderm is just, more of your internal organs. So the digestive system, the respiratory tract, the pancreas, liver, thyroid, parathyroid, a lot of hormonal organs and a lot of internal organs, your digestive system, endo meaning inside. So a lot of those internal structures arise from the endoderm. So you should definitely look this over. You can, try to come up with your own mnemonics, but the three germ layers is definitely something that they like to test. So I definitely think it's worth your time spending and just remembering. I mean, sometimes it's impossible to remember every single structure that arises from each germ layer, but it's important that you memorize at least a couple that come from each, the most common ones. Okay, so the next step we have is neurulation. So after the germ layer is developed, the nervous system forms next, and this process is known as neurulation. So the ectoderm, like we said before, gives rise to the neural plate and the neural crest cells, because remember the ectoderm gives rise to the central and peripheral nervous system, and it's the attractoderm. So it also gives rise to skin, nails, those sorts of tissue. So the neural plate folds into itself, creating a neural tube, which eventually gives rise to the central nervous system. So I placed this graphic right to the right. You can take a look at the top. The neural plate is here in purple. So it's sort of, folded in half. This will eventually become the epidermis, this blue outer, and then the neural plate border is going to fold over and will become the neural crest cells. But if you look one step down, you can see actually how it folds inward on itself. These neural crest cells bend over to touch themselves. They converge at the top of the neural groove. And then once that convergence is complete, the neural groove turns into the neural tube. These neural crest cells are surrounding and the epidermis is on top. So the epidermis will eventually become your skin, and the neural tube will eventually develop into the central nervous system around your backbone. So after differentiation, birth, and early life. So at 8 weeks gestation, the embryo can now be referred to as a fetus. So it's developing more human-like features. Toward the end of pregnancy, the mother's respiratory rate, blood volume, GFR, and other vital processes all increase as the fetus develops into an independent human. And that tracks pretty logically, because as this fetus is developing into a full-blown human, it's going to need more resources. So it's going to need more oxygen, it's going to need more nutrients, and likewise, it's going to be giving off more waste products. So it would make sense that the mother's GFR also increases. So all of these processes vital for living are going to increase as the baby gets bigger. Yeah, GFR is glomerular filtration rate. It's just about how much blood the kidneys can filter per minute. So if you want a quick refresher, I did a lesson on the renal system last week, so you can definitely look at those slides. Feel free to go to the YouTube channel and look at that as well, because GFR is definitely something that you should be familiar with as well. So birth is also known as parturition. It occurs when contractions of the uterine muscles begin. These contractions are repressed throughout pregnancy by the high levels of progesterone throughout. They most likely begin in the late third trimester due to an increase in oxytocin and also physical stretching of the uterus and the cervix. So as the child gets bigger, it's going to be pushing against the uterus and it's going to be pushing onto the cervix for the first time. So most scientists believe that in combination of a couple of other factors, it's not completely 100% clear, but it's definitely with the spike in oxytocin. I've even heard some theories regarding the circulation of fetal DNA, like increases in that. But all you have to know in terms of oxytocin is that it's repressed by progesterone, and when it increases towards contraction, it actually causes contraction in a positive feedback loop, actually. So estrogen and progesterone levels during pregnancy also inhibit the release of prolactin. So prolactin is responsible for milk letdown. So after birth, estrogen and progesterone levels fall and prolactin levels rise. So when prolactin levels rise, that allows the mother to produce milk. So prolactin levels surge actually every time the infant breastfeeds. And prolactin levels will remain high and they will continue to surge the child breastfeeds. They will not decrease to pre-pregnancy levels until the child is no longer breastfeeding. So as long as the child is breastfeeding, those prolactin levels will surge. And milk letdown, which is just another name for milk production, will occur in the mother. Okay, that brings us to our first review question. So a newborn child is found to have a congenital defect, which affects the strength of the connection between bone and skeletal muscle. This defect is found throughout the body, which germ layer has likely developed abnormally. So I'm going to give you guys about a minute. Think about it. Try not to look back, see if you remember anything. Take a guess. Everything is anonymous, so I'm going to share the poll. Let me know what you think, and we're going to go over it. I'll give you guys about 5 more seconds to get your answers in. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll. Okay, so 17% of you said A, 8% of you said B, 75% said C, and nobody said D or I have no idea. Cool. So the correct answer is in fact C. Remember mesoderm, the mnemonic to remember that is the mesoderm is the means of movement. So if we're talking about bone and skeletal muscle, that's definitely movement. So just remember that those come from the mesoderm. The endoderm is more so internal organs. The ectoderm, remember tractoderm. Your nervous system comes from that, your skin cells. The exoderm I just made up. So good job for nobody picking that one. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about that before I move on? You guys seem to do pretty well with that, so. Okay, if you do, feel free to put them in the chat. So moving on, the biology of human development. So we're going to talk briefly about biology of human development after birth. So let's talk about reflexes in babies. Newborn humans have reflexes which help them navigate the new world around them before they develop the skills to process their environment cognitively. So there's not a lot of cognitive processing going on in newborns. So they need a way to, keep them keep them alive and help them navigate their environment. And these primitive reflexes are the way that they accomplish that. So I just put some of the more common reflexes that you may see up here. It's not super necessary that you know all of them by heart, but you should be able to identify them and you should be familiar with them when you see them on the MCAT. So the Moro reflex is the first one. And that entails the baby being startled at loud sounds. So when the baby hears loud sounds or quick motions, it will extend its arms and legs out, cry, and it will extend its limbs back in. So some of these are kind of funny to conceptualize, and if you want to, they're actually kind of interesting. And you can find videos online of babies doing this. It's actually really interesting. Some of the ways that they check for neurological defects in adults is to see if some of these reflexes are present, because these reflexes are supposed to disappear pretty soon after other skills are developed in babies. So within the first couple of years, most of these reflexes, or actually all of these reflexes, should be gone. So if they're present in adults, that usually indicates some sort of neurological disorder. And the same is true for the opposite. If these are absent in children and babies, infants, where it should be present, that can also indicate some sort of neurological upset. Yes, absolutely. The Babinski reflex is definitely the most common one that I've seen. Babinski, rooting, and I want to say palmar grasp are probably the three most common that I see. So rooting reflex, the baby, upon being touched on the cheek, will turn its head in the direction that it was touched to open its mouth to breastfeed. Pretty straightforward. The sucking reflex, again, sort of goes hand in hand with the rooting reflex. It just allows the baby to eat without, having a conscious effort to take in food. The baby will begin sucking when something touches the roof of its mouth. So, when the baby starts to breastfeed and the nipple touches its mouth, it's going to start breastfeeding. The Babinski reflex is when the sole of the foot is stroked, the baby will fan its toes out and curl its big toe upward. So this specifically is one that I've seen on the MCAT where they use to indicate in adults neurological defects. If the Babinski reflex is present in adults, then that usually indicates that. So yeah, like Janelle said, that's one that I would be familiar with. The tonic neck reflex, when the baby's head is turned to one side, the arm on that side will extend out and the opposite arm will bend up at the elbow. So this is probably the one that was like the most difficult to actually, conceptualize. So the picture at the top of the cute little baby over there is actually demonstrating the tonic neck reflex. So you can see the baby is looking to the right. That arm is extended out and the other one is, bent up at the elbow. The palmar grasp reflex, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, the baby will grasp in response to something stroking its hand. So if you've ever seen a newborn waving its hand and you put your finger right there, he's going to squeeze it. That's the palmar grasp reflex. And the stepping attempt to put the other foot in front to walk. So this reflex is present in newborns, and it, strangely enough, is present in newborns. It disappears around 6 weeks, and then it reappears again around 10 to 12 months when the baby starts to learn to walk. So it reappears just in time, and it helps the baby actually learn to walk before they can, cognitively understand what they're doing. But like I said, this is definitely something you should be familiar with. It's a good thing to review, and it's a good thing to understand why babies exhibit reflexes. And maybe a couple of them you should know a little bit more in detail. So we're going to talk a little bit more about motor development in children. So the first year of a human's life is dominated by reflexive movements, as we just talked about. So those are the primitive movements that they're innate. We're born with them, and before we can process things, in our mind, they help us navigate the environment. They help us survive. So the first voluntary movements performed by babies are referred to as rudimentary movements. So these are rolling, crawling, sitting up, any sort of locomotion or movement of limbs that you can think of that babies do. These are the rudimentary movements, and it coincides with the reflexive movements. Rudimentary movements are usually exhibited between birth to about 2 years old. So yeah, it's in the same time frame as reflexive movements. These two sort of overlap. Fundamental movements are the next types of movements that are developed. So they're usually developed from ages 2 to 7. These are more coordinated activities, not too complex, but you need a little bit more advanced brain functioning to coordinate these movements. So like running, jumping, throwing, and these usually develop as children engage in more physical and social play. So these children are growing up, they enter 3, 4, 5, they start to go to school, they might even join organized sports. So that's how they develop these fundamental movements. At about age 7, they enter the stage of specialized movement, and this occurs from about ages 7 to 14. So in this stage, we're basically just building on fundamental movements. These movements are going to be combined, and we're going to execute complex movements. So when you think about sports, usually sports for really young children, the rules are simplified, the mechanics are simplified. So as you start to get older, these sort of, the rules become a little bit more similar to what you would see for an adult game. And maybe, the actual movements that the children are performing are going to become a little bit more complex and a little bit more coordinated. So at this point, a developing child is also more readily able to apply the skill and strategy to these movements. So if they're playing a sport, they'll be able to use their prior knowledge to apply skill to the movement. So that's also a pretty important aspect of specialized movement, is that sort of top-down component. And then after age 14, from adolescence and on, the next stage they move into is the application of movement stage. And it's basically just building on specialized movement throughout your life. So humans are going to continue to apply these movements and refine them during normal daily and recreational activities. So the older we get, the more our motor skills are refined, the more skill and strategy we acquire to apply to these skills. And that's basically just what that stage means. We're constantly learning and we're constantly refining our skills throughout adulthood. Okay, and then we're going to talk a little bit about brain development from children to adult, very briefly. So a newborn child will have the most neurons at that point than at any other point in their life. However, they will not have many neural networks. So neural networks are developed as children grow and learn, and these neural networks are routes for information processing. So newborn children have a bunch of neurons, but they're not necessarily linked together in a way that's helping them out. So the way we grow and learn is actually, it's a process called long-term potentiation. Neurons that fire together wire together. So as we learn, we create these neural networks through our brain. And that's really how we learn. That's how we encode in our memory. And that's something that children don't have, but they have the potential for it because they have so many neurons. So that's something that we establish as we grow. So maturation is the sequence by which children grow and develop. The process of maturation is mostly genetic and it's mostly universal. So like when we're developing motor functions, it's almost completely universal when all children do it. They'll begin to crawl, they'll be able to sit up, then they'll finally be able to stand, then they'll be able to walk, then they'll be able to run. So that happens pretty sequentially and pretty universally sequentially throughout, with small exceptions. But there are instances in which environmental factors can have an influence on maturation. So for example, language acquisition is one that's cited a lot when it comes to environmental factors and maturation. So when it comes to environmental factors and maturation, so if a child, typically deaf children, for example, deaf children that don't have access to language at an early age, we see significant delays in language and cognitive processing. So deaf children actually process sign language exactly the same way as a hearing child will process an auditory language. It uses the same part of the brain. We can even see deaf children enter the babbling stage just as a child that speaks would. They would actually babble with their hands. So it's super interesting. And I mean, if you're interested in that, it's definitely, worth a read or worth a video watch because it really is cool. But it's a really great example of how environmental factors can also influence the sequence of maturation. Humans generally do not remember events before the age of 3 to 3.5. This is referred to as infantile amnesia. This does not mean that infants can't learn and memorize, because there's a bunch of evidence. We know that infants are constantly learning, they're constantly absorbing, and they do show the ability to retain memory. It's just that, in the long term, most adults will not be able to recall any information that was, that was learned before the age of 3 or 3.5. And there's a lot of debate about what causes infantile amnesia, if it's actually true. But this is the definition that you should know for the MCAT and should apply in your studies. What if the child, Opal said, what if the child becomes deaf after? In terms of maturation, as long as they're like in that specific example that we're talking about, as long as they have access to language at the point a child should have access to, then we shouldn't really expect to see any language processing or cognitive defects. Because humans grow up, we're supposed to grow up in an environment that's rich in language. So I just used the example of a deaf child just to show you like an example of where that could possibly happen and where unfortunately it happens too often. But I mean, if the child becomes deaf after language acquisition, in terms of that specific example, then I wouldn't really expect there to be too many cognitive defects in that specific stage. So we're going to review again. So a child has joined a basketball league for the first time. He's learning to shoot a basketball, which involves dribbling, grasping, aiming, throwing, and releasing. This child is most likely developing his. I will give you guys a minute. I'm going to open the polls right now. And we'll regroup and rediscuss in a minute. All right, guys, take another 5 seconds, get your answers in. Remember, this is anonymous, so take a guess. If you have no idea, hit I have no idea. Okay, so I'm going to close the polls. All right, so 8% of you said A, 15% said B, 23% said C, 54% said D. So the correct answer is in fact D. These are specialized movements. So the child is joining the basketball league for the first time. Remember that when they're joining the basketball league, this is going to involve dribbling, grasping, aiming, throwing. These are all coordinated movements. So after the child develops their fundamental movements when they're a little bit younger, we're going to expect them to take those fundamental movements, combine them, add strategy, and then this is how we come upon specialized movements. So these sort of complex movements that are involved in recreational sports are specialized. Yeah, and reflexive, the child would be too old to demonstrate reflexive movements. Same rudimentary movements are more just like walking, crawling, grabbing. And then fundamental movements are sort of, walking and running, but they're not as coordinated. A child that has only developed fundamental movements and hasn't yet developed specialized movements would not be able to effectively dribble, grasp the ball, aim, and throw the ball. So that skill takes specialized movement. Is everyone clear on that? Cool. Okay, so now we're going to get into theories of human development. I'm going to outline 2 of the most common ones that you'll see on the MCAT, and I do see them a lot. So this is basically, Psych and Soc is basically just raw content review. It's pretty much you're just going to have to, get through the material, review it, and make sure it stays up there. So we're going to go through it. Again, like I've said a million times, feel free to go back to the YouTube lectures. You can slow them down. You can use captions, anything that's going to help you study. You can print out our slides, make notes on them, look them over. So the first theory that we're going to go over is Freud's theory of psychosexual development. And we have Sigmund Freud right over there chilling to the right. So Sigmund Freud put forth a theory of human development through the lens of his psychosexual analysis. As I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, he was famous for his psychosexual analysis, psychodynamic, the id, ego, and superego. So he believed that the way in which humans channel their sexual energy throughout childhood was a major factor in personality formation when they reached adulthood. He split these up into different categories. Yes, a wild man indeed. Wild doesn't even cover it. So he believed that the way in which humans, I read that already, he believed specifically that the first 5 years of humans' life were crucial in personality formation. So this was when he believed humans developed the ego and superego to counteract the primal urges that resulted from the it. So just to do a super quick review of that, the three components of personality, we have the ego, the superego, and the id. The id is your primal desires, sexual desires that are often inappropriate in a social context. The superego is your ideals, your values, the person that you strive to be. So those two aspects of your personality pretty much compete. And the ego is sort of the mediator of the two. So the ego is what is expressed and what is socially acceptable in that moment. Right. So if someone did not resolve the major conflict during one of these stages, they would develop a fixation that would persist throughout adulthood. So we're going to go through the stages, and we are going to talk about those fixations a little bit more. So stage one is the oral stage. So that goes from birth to about 1 year of age. So basically, Freud believed that all children had sexual energy, and basically everything, whenever you study Freud, everything comes back to channeling sexual energy. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter who you are, anything having to do with you. So every single person on this earth, from birth to 1 year, he believed that your sexual energy was focused on the mouth. And infants primarily suck, bite, and breastfeed at this age. So most of the functions that babies do at that point involves their mouth. So the id, which dominates the adult's human sexual and primal desires, is responsible for this drive to pleasure in infants and children as well, like we just spoke about a little bit. So when you're in this stage, those who are not allowed to satisfy these urges during this stage are going to develop what Freud referred to as an oral fixation. So that's going to remain throughout adulthood. So an example of a few, we have smokers, nail biters, thumb suckers, all of those sort of habits that we see in adulthood that, in the year 2021, we can probably attribute them to, something else other than not being able to breastfeed when you're a year old. Freud believed that was the main cause, and that it affects you throughout adulthood. Yep, vaping as well. And I'd also like to preface this Freud lecture with the fact that if you go to most undergrad and most graduate studies, Freud is usually taught in the literature department, not the psychology department, just because most psychologists agree today that there's not a lot of scientific merit to most of his studies. They're really great in terms of literature. They pop up in literature all the time. I mean, you could teach an entire class about one single thing that Freud has done from a literary perspective. But there's pretty much a general consensus that a lot of this stuff is unfounded. Nonetheless, it was super influential in a lot of other psychologists that came after him. Like we'll be talking about Erikson in a little bit. And a lot of his theory piggybacked off of Freud, although it's a little bit more based in science than this. So someone asked, if people manifest anxiety as nail biting, is that correlated with an oral stage fixation? I'm sure Freud would definitely make the case. People today we can probably make the connection that anxiety, we use nail biting as an outlet for anxiety. If Freud saw that someone was nail biting, he would probably opt for the explanation that there was some sort of problem in the oral stage and it resulted in a fixation. Okay, and just someone requested to go back really quickly. So this, again, stage 1. Okay, no problem. So the second stage, we're moving from oral to stage 2, which is anal, and that is from about 1 to 3 years old. So the child's pleasure outlet switches from the mouth to the anus. And during this stage, the child is concerned with defecation, as this is when children are potty trained. So might seem like a weird thing to be hung up on, but it's actually kind of funny because a lot of psychologists of this time really consider potty training as a super important part, interestingly enough, of personality development. And, reading up on it a little bit, it's mostly because potty training is pretty much the first time in a child's life where they're being confronted with actual authority. So if you think about it, beforehand, they're pretty much doing everything according to what they need to do, because there's really no sense in training a 6-month-old. If they make a mistake, you're not going to reason with the 6-month-old. So they never had to really deal with authority. They're not in school. There's really no structure to their lives. And potty training really is that first confrontation with authority that they have. So Freud and Erikson were pretty much in agreement with that, that potty training does really establish how a child sees authority throughout their life. And consequently, children develop the ego during this stage. So the 3 aspects, the ego is developed, the child is developing a sense of self and a sense of how to project themselves to the outer world. A child that undergoes a harsh or early potty training experience may become what we refer to as anal retentive in adulthood. And anal retentive adults, according to Freud, were obsessively organized. They were overly respectful of authority. They're not easily strayed from their plans. They get very anxious if they're strayed from their plans. And we still do sometimes use the word anal in colloquial language to refer to people who act this way. That's actually, this is actually where the term came from. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, a child that experiences a relaxed or late potty training with parents that are not very caring about it, if they didn't grow up in that environment, they become what Freud called anal expulsive. So they become messy, unorganized, very go with the flow, not really bothered by much. So he really thought that potty training really, really affected your personality this much. So moving on to stage 3. Stage 3 is from about 3 to 6 years of age, and it's known as the phallic stage. So the child now focuses his or her libido onto the genitalia. And this is more so abstract because we say focuses his or her libido onto the genitalia. So this can sort of be confusing with one of the later stages, the genital stage that we'll go over in a couple of minutes. But this is more abstract, and it really more so has to do with gender roles and how they're relating to their parents. So the child recognizes the difference between both sexes. So they're becoming aware of the fact that males and females are biologically different. And they begin to identify with the same sex parent. So Freud believed that a young boy will start to identify with his father, probably start to take on his ideals and attitudes. And this process is called identification. And that is how the child resolves his Oedipal complex, or if she is a female child, her Electra complex, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. I'm sure some of you even read Oedipus Rex. So to more closely bond with the parent of the opposite sex, the child will adopt the attitudes and values of the same sex parent. So the Oedipal complex, as I'm sure you guys know, is, a son wants to remove the father from the picture to completely dominate the mother figure. So Freud believed that this was like a fundamental struggle in this period, and the way that the child overcame this struggle was to identify with the same sex parent and adopt the attitudes and values of that same sex parent. So this is how Freud believed that the superego developed. So like we mentioned before, the ego is how you project yourself to others, and the superego is basically the ideals and the values that you strive to be. So the superego is sort of keeping your id in check. And Freud believed that the superego was subjective. So it was developed by example. So he believed that, same-sex parents, and when I say same-sex parent, I don't mean same-sex couples. I mean same-sex meaning a boy would relate to his father and a girl would relate to her mother. So that's how he believed that these children develop their superego. Okay, so once they resolve that and they leave that stage, stage 4 is latency, and this is about 6 years to puberty. So, about 12 to 14-ish. So Freud believed that during this period, a child's sexual energy completely disappears. It goes completely dormant. It is nowhere to be found anymore. So babies and toddlers, sexual energy. A 9-year-old, no sexual energy. The child is preoccupied with learning, making social connections, and acquiring new skills. So he believes that this newfound social environment, we're meeting new people, we're learning new things, we're learning in school, we're learning skills outside of school. He believed that the sexual energy just went dormant. And he also believed that play in this stage becomes largely confined to those of the same sex. Which, I guess you could see some evidence for that. When you see children in, middle to late elementary school, boys will flock with boys, girls will flock with girls. So I guess he just saw that and made it part of his theory. Yeah, so someone brought up stage 3 theory. What about single parent homes? Who does the child identify with? Which is super true. I'm sure that there are some pretty cool criticisms online if you look at that. And I'm sure that's something that Freud had addressed in his lifetime. He probably chalked it up to some sort of fixation resulting from that stage or some sort of perversion resulting from that stage. That's usually what happens when something goes wrong or when something doesn't fit into these sorts of theories. They're pretty much just like, oh, fixation, oh, perversion. But that's a really interesting question, and I think that'll probably be pretty interesting to look up as well. And you can see kind of just in the 21st century how you can easily poke holes in some of these theories. So they're not really meant to be taken seriously at this point, but it's important to learn about them in a historical context because they did give rise to some other theories that we do use today. So it's not completely useless, and that's why they still test your knowledge of it. So stage 5 is the genital stage, and that is from puberty to adulthood. So the teenager's sexual energy is most obviously focused on the genitals. And like I was making the distinction before, this is more of like physical sexual energy being focused on the genitals, whereas the phallic stage was more so gender roles and more of an abstract representation of it. So in this stage, young humans will experiment sexually and eventually settle down with an opposite sex partner in their 20s, which again, this is, Freud's thinking from the 20th century. Obviously, he did not have a 21st century view of gender and sexuality. So these theories tend to seem a little bit outdated when we look at them. In this stage, fixations rooted in other stages become apparent. So this is the stage where all of these other fixations that we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes become apparent, and this is where they become a problem. So oral, anal, and phallic fixations may appear in sexual habits. And he said any disruptions in this stage or these past stages could result in sexual perversions. So he believed that these sexual perversions were evident of fixations that were a result from any of these 5 stages. So sexual perversions are referring to, behaviors out of the norm. So sexual attractions, like extra human sexual attractions. I don't want to go too in depth to it. You can definitely look it up. Maybe things that we would refer to today as kinks, he would refer to as sexual perversions. But then also things that, we still consider, disordered sexually, like pedophilia, stuff like that. But I'm sure if you were to ask Freud, he would probably consider other like more mainstream ideas, sexual perversions, like sexualities that aren't heterosexual. I'm sure he would have considered perversions as well. But yeah, that's the gist of it. Okay, so we're going to do another review. So an adult woman is spending way too much time smoking. This has caused relationship problems with her spouse. and has caused her to miss multiple important milestones in her daughter's life. Freud may say that this woman was A, B, C, or D. Take a minute, and we will regroup and discuss. All right, guys, get your answers in. Another 5 seconds, and we're going to go over it. I should have made this a little harder. Okay, so no one said A, no one said B, 8% said C, 83% said D, and 8% said I have no idea. So yeah, you guys got it. The correct answer is D. So smoking would be an indication of an oral fixation. And Freud believed that oral fixations resulted from not being able to release that sexual energy during the oral stage. So potty training too harshly would be during the anal stage and would result in an anal retentive human being. Not being potty trained strictly enough, again, would be from the anal stage and result in anal expulsive personality traits. Having unresolved issues with her father, I guess would probably be the phallic stage, and was not breastfed or allowed a pacifier would be the oral stage. And that would, according to Freud, most likely result in smoking. Yep. Yeah, so Freud is a pretty polarizing character. People are very opinionated on him. Because a lot of people do still use some of his concepts today. And for a while throughout the 20th century, a lot of people did use his concepts, and they proved to be kind of harmful to certain groups. So he is a controversial but interesting figure nonetheless. So we do have to know about him. On the other hand, Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, in my opinion, is a little bit more grounded in fact and a little bit less abstract and a little bit more intuitive when we learn about it. So while Freud's theory of human development is centralized around the idea that our output of sexual energy determines our characteristics in adulthood, Erikson's theory of psychosocial development focuses on how we perceive our identity at various stages of life. So he's psychosocial, so he is more concerned with how our mind develops in the context of our social environment. So his theory was impacted by Freud. However, Erikson divides the life cycle into 8 stages in which every human will, in the same order, experience a set of conflicts. So a person can emerge from each stage either having strengthened their character with a new virtue, or they can leave it with a sense of inadequacy regarding that specific area of his or her personality. So 8 stages, there are going to be 2 combating concepts, and basically one is going to win. So you're either going to get the virtue from it, or you're going to end it with a sense of inadequacy, and you may not be able to move on to the next stage efficiently, or you may not be able to accomplish future stages effectively. So stage 1 is trust versus mistrust, and this is from about birth to 18 months. Newborn children must be completely dependent on their parents in this stage. So children who have caring and attentive parents will develop a sense of trust that should persist into adulthood. So children who have parents who prove to be inconsistent, uncaring, unsupportive, Erikson thinks that they may never fully develop a sense of trust throughout adulthood. So remember, this is from birth to 18 months. So the child is completely dependent on their parents. So Erikson believed that this had a really big impact about how we trust the outside world. So like I said, if you accomplish this stage correctly, if everything is correct in your environment such that you can form trusting relationships with your parents, you will achieve the virtue of hope. So throughout adulthood, you will be able to hope, you will be able to trust other people, and know that there are people in the world that are worthy of trust. If you don't, you'll just have a very mistrusting, very cynical outlook on life, and it's going to affect your relationships later on. So stage 2 is autonomy versus shame and doubt, and this is about 8 months to 3 years. So in this age range, children are developing motor skills for the first time. They're becoming physically independent. They don't need to be carried around by their parents. They're starting to walk. They're starting to exercise independence for the first time in their life. So when they're able to develop their sense of independence in a supporting and forgiving environment, they gain a sense of adequacy and a sense of control over their life. So the child will actually experience this sense of independence as a positive thing rather than a scary thing. If children in this stage are not allowed independence, if they are not allowed to make decisions, if they're shamed for their mistakes, again, particularly with potty training, so Erikson is also placing some importance on potty training, they may feel ashamed or as if they have no self-control. So whereas Freud really focused the potty training aspect more on how the parents enforce it, whether it's strict or lax, Erikson is saying it's really the consequences of what the child does. So we should let the child make their mistakes. We should correct their actions in a forgiving environment. But if we make them feel ashamed for their mistakes, they're going to carry this shame throughout their adulthood. And they're going to be afraid to make these sort of decisions. And they're going to have, ego issues and dependence issues. So he believes that upon the successful completion of the stage, the child will develop will. So the child develops free will. They are aware that they are able to make their own decisions freely. And they have to accomplish this stage successfully in order to develop that sense of will. So stage 3 is initiative versus guilt. And this brings us to about 3 to 5 years of age. So in this stage of life, children are in preschool and they enter other social environments for the first time, maybe clubs, other friends, and they have to learn to navigate these new social environments. So they're learning all of these new social cues, how to interact with other children, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. So they're taking initiative for the first time. Children who successfully overcome this conflict will take initiative in their learning and their play with others. So they also may develop a sense of leadership, and this is a good thing. So in this stage, it's very important that the child doesn't feel scared to initiate relationships, that they don't feel scared to take on a sense of leadership, because there haven't been many opportunities in their life thus far for them to be able to develop that sense of leadership. And children who are punished for coming on too forceful, say, in a kindergarten class, if they come on too forceful to another student, or the opposite, if they're not showing enough initiative in their play with the others, they may develop a strong sense of guilt, which could inhibit their initiativeness throughout adulthood. So Erikson just believed that they should not be punished too strictly for not showing enough initiative or coming on too forceful, because they can develop that sense of guilt. So those who successfully learn to lead and play in their social circles will develop a sense of purpose. So they're learning for the first time how to fit into a social group, and they learn these social structures and they learn their purpose inside the group. So if they're a leader, they can find purpose in that way. If they're supporting some other sort of activity, they find purpose in that way. But the virtue for this stage is purpose. So stage 4 is industry versus inferiority, and this is about 5 to 12 years. So this is school-age children. In this stage of life, children are advancing through elementary school. They face increasing burdens of social and academic obstacles. So again, they're coming across obstacles that they've never come across before. They're now going to feel pressure to demonstrate their initiative into new social groups. So these social hierarchies that we see that are super prevalent in high school groups begin to form in elementary school. So they're going to feel pressure to fit in. They're going to feel, like they have to establish themselves as a specific part of the social group. So if they can demonstrate their ability successfully and without ridicule, they feel a sense of industry. So an industrious person is someone who feels competent in their skills. They're industrious, they're able to accomplish. If the child's attempts at industry are discouraged or failed attempts are overly punished, the child is going to feel a sense of inferiority among his or her peers. Because again, remember, they're now fitting into this new advanced social structure. So not only are they going to feel guilt about not being able to accomplish it themselves, they're going to now start to feel a sense of inferiority because they're looking at others and they're looking at themselves in relation to others. So that sense of inferiority is a threat for those who can't accomplish this, who can't overcome this conflict. Successfully completing this stage of life, however, results in the virtue of competence, like we mentioned a little bit earlier. So industry and competence go hand in hand. If they're able to successfully fit themselves into the social structure and they are happy with themselves, the virtue of competence will follow them throughout adulthood. So stage 5 is identity versus role confusion, and this is from about 12 to 18 years of age, so teenage years. During late middle school and high school, teenagers are exploring new activities, new social groups, and they're going to wish to solidify their identity even more so than in elementary school. We gain a new sense of independence, and we start to meet a lot more people. We meet those that are older than us, that are younger than us at this point, rather than just being confined to peers of our same age. And we start to realize that there's more to identity than just this cookie cutter sort of identity that we've been living throughout our childhood. Because many people grasp their identity through childhood through their immediate friend groups and through their households. But when you grow, your exposure to media, your exposure to different social groups, your concept of identity expands. And it's a concept that Erikson believed very much so needed to be addressed. So if teenagers can successfully overcome this conflict, they'll gain a sense of ego. Based on their life experiences in social groups, they will develop their own system of ideals, beliefs, and values. So we mentioned a while ago that ego develops in toddlers. That means just the sense of self. They are aware that they are a sense of self. Ego in this context means that they are solidifying their own individual sense of ideals, beliefs, and values. So they're developing their own ideals. Which is a little bit interesting because Freud believed that the ideals, beliefs, and values developed in the phallic stage when a child was about 3 to 6. And Erikson believes that this sense of ego is not really truly solidified until we're 12 to 18 years old, when we can actually consciously process things, think them through, and make these ideals our own. Which, makes sense to me because we're constantly thinking and reevaluating our ideals when we're presented with new information. So to me, it would definitely make sense that this process carries on throughout our teenage years and honestly, even through our early 20s and 30s. So if they're not able to interact freely with their peers and express their own ideals freely, they may experience role confusion. So they're going to experience unhappiness and they're going to face uncertainty about how they fit into society. So the virtue developed after the successful completion of stage 5 is fidelity. So when they are confident in their own identity, they will be able to accept others for their identity. So fidelity, they will be able to accept others for their own identity and create relationships based off of this reconciliation of differences. So stage 6 is intimacy versus isolation. And this lasts from about 19 years to 40 years of age. So during this stage, young adults are seeking intimacy and to build long-term relationships. And this stage builds on earlier stages. Those who are able to establish successful and meaningful relationships with others have proven that they are well-developed and well-rounded human being. So these relationships result in long-term commitment and care, which Erikson believed was the fundamental goal in terms of intimacy. He believed that long-term commitment was the fundamental goal of all humans, which I'm sure you'll find some people who don't agree. Fear, anxiety, and a weak sense of self can result in an inability to establish secure relationships with others. This may result in loneliness, emotional isolation, and depression. So fear, anxiety, and a weak sense of self, these are all other things that we could have struggled with that Erikson may have believed arose from arose from the previous stages. So, I mean, if you end up isolated, you're going to be lonely, and it could result in depression. So intuitively, the virtue acquired upon successful completion of this stage obviously is love. Well, we hope that being too busy studying for your MCAT won't result in loneliness, emotional isolation, and depression. It's just going to be temporary, and it's all going to be worth it. So remember that. So Erikson's seventh stage is generativity versus stagnation. And this is middle age, about 40 years to 65 years of age. So during the middle age, human beings will experience a desire to create or nurture individuals or concepts that will continue after them. So they're reaching middle age, and they're starting to, Erikson believed that in this stage, humans start to gain a greater sense of the bigger picture, and they start to care about things that will be here after they are. So those who mentor, give back to their communities, partake in productive activities, will feel a sense of what he calls generativity, and as if they are contributing to the bigger picture, as if they're part of a larger whole piece. And he believed that this was a fundamental feeling that humans at this stage experience. So those who fail to contribute during this stage may feel uninvolved in the world, they may feel unproductive, and they could feel unconnected and cut off to future generations. So the virtue acquired in this stage is care. So they will be able to care about others. They're not so focused on themselves anymore, and they're able to direct some of that care to, their children, those in their community. Any way that they can give back to their community is where their care will be developed and focused. So middle age is all about paying it forward for posterity. And then the final stage is stage 8, which is integrity versus despair. And this is about 65 years to death. So older adults in this range look back on their lives and they evaluate what they did with their lives, how they turned out. If we look back at our lives and we feel a sense of pride, a sense of accomplishment, happiness, it establishes a sense of integrity with us, a sense of completion. If we look back on our lives with regret, we're going to experience fear, anxiety, despair, because you only get one life. So we look back, and it just results in not a happy outcome. So this is what Erikson believed happens at this age. Integrity allows us to be satisfied with what we did with our lives. And he believed that this was a very important piece that allowed people in this age range to accept death peacefully as a natural end to the things that they've accomplished on Earth. So the virtue that would be achieved by successful completion of this stage is wisdom. So you've had years experience, you know what to expect, and you're peaceful. You have the wisdom, you have acquired the wisdom to make you feel comfortable accepting death as a natural part of the life cycle. So those are the two. And Erikson's theory, unlike a couple of other theories of development, span across the entire life. A lot of theories of development usually end when, you get out of the teenage years and that sort of development ends. And then it just lumps adulthood into one thing. But Erikson's theory actually still splits the different life stages, even after your 20s. So someone said, is it valid to criticize Erikson's theory by stating that people can develop virtues like care before the age range he suggested? Yeah, I would say it's definitely valid. I think any criticism of theories is definitely valid as long as you have the evidence to back it up. So you can, for example, if you think care could develop before stage 6, I believe it was, if you think that that is something that could develop before stage 6, what would happen is, you could look into specifically what he thought care was, or specifically when he thought care developed. And yeah, it would definitely be a valid criticism. In fact, it's a really good idea to look at any theories you learn about through the lens of criticism. We should always be critical and we should always be skeptical. Yeah, I would definitely review Piaget's theory. I don't have it in this slide just because we're super pressed for time. And this is like such a wide range, such a wide topic to discuss. So I just wanted to touch upon some of the things that I thought were super high yield. But yeah, Piaget, you should definitely know. You got it. Oh, Lord. Okay. So we're not going to open the poll to this because I forgot to add a transition. We're just going to review it. So a child just entering middle school is anxious about his ability to lead in social groups and interact with his peers competently. He is currently struggling to resolve which conflict? And the answer is A. If you guys want to posit some explanations as to why you think it is industry versus inferiority, you can type them in the chat box, and maybe we can explore that for the next minute or so. But trust versus mistrust would definitely be incorrect because that's stage 1. That usually occurs from 0 to 18 months. So a child entering middle school would not fall under that category. Again, identity versus role confusion, the age range is a little bit off. It's more so for children that are leaving middle school and entering high school, leaving high school. And role confusion really has to do with the sense of self and how you see yourself in context with others. And initiative versus guilt, again, is for younger children. And that has to do with becoming independent and, potty training for the first time. Are they going to be afraid? Are they going to feel guilty if they make mistakes? Yeah, exactly. The child did not develop competence. So like Kazi said, the virtue that comes out of completing the industry versus inferiority conflict successfully is competence. So the child entering middle school is anxious about his ability to lead in social groups. So we can assume that this child is struggling with competence and is struggling to interact with his peers. And in fact, I even put competently right there. So that should be a giveaway. If you can remember that competence is the virtue that comes out of industry versus inferiority, then this should be a fairly straightforward question to answer. Okay, does anybody have any questions on that before we move on?
There are overlaps. There are overlaps with these theories, correct?
Yeah, so I guess you can consider, you mean like the virtues, sort of what you would get out of it, and maybe like the things that would go wrong.
Yeah, or maybe one stage lasts a little longer, a little shorter. It might not take till teenage years before you have that sense of who you are. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. There could be some overlap
brought up
of sequentially. Yeah. So all of the age ranges that we give, since it's a theory, they're usually just estimates of the time frames that each of them last. But like, for example, if a child is just entering middle school and you're thinking trust versus mistrust, that's not right, because we're talking about an infant for trust versus mistrust. So a child entering middle school will not be dealing with that conflict, according to Erickson. Okay, so next we're going to touch upon the big 5 personality traits. We'll do one more question and then we should be done with the content review. So the big 5 is the most common personality model that you'll see. It's also known as the 5-factor model. This personality model assesses 5 facets believed to make up human personality. It is currently the most widely used theory of personality in the field of psychology. And one of the reasons why it is used is because each of the 5 factors is measured on a spectrum to give an individual result to each personality. So if you're familiar with the Myers-Briggs assessment, it will use some of these facets and it will basically just give you a binary answer. The Big 5 model rates percentages on a spectrum. So there are 5 factors. They are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And these can be remembered with the acronym OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N. So if you're familiar with these words, you can definitely use OCEAN to remember it. It's super helpful. I think there was another acronym as well. I can't remember which one, but I mean, OCEAN was always the most helpful one to me. So the Big 5 model, it was popularized by McRae and Costa. Like we said, has 5 factors. So openness is how open an individual is to learning. how open they are to exploring new places, ideas, how insightful an individual is. So someone that demonstrates all of these qualities will score very high in the openness aspect on the Big Five model. Conscientiousness is how reliable an individual is. So these conscientious individuals, they're organized, they're very prompt, they are easily depended on, they're very dependable individuals, they're conscientious, they care about others. So someone who demonstrates that will score very high in that aspect. Extroversion is how comfortable and the energy that we get from when we are around others. Extroverted individuals are usually more outgoing and they're more comfortable in the presence of others. So extroversion is that definition. Some people tend to think that extroversion means you're a people person, which it's not necessarily true, because you can be introverted and be a people person. It's more so about basically about how you recharge around people. So extroverts are comfortable around people. They can relax and be themselves when they're around people, when they're in a group. They're not super fond of being alone. Introverts can definitely be people person and they can enjoy interacting with people, but they need alone time to recharge. They feel most comfortable when they are alone. So if you're an extrovert, you will score high with this on the spectrum. And if you're more introverted, you will score more low. Agreeableness is how cooperative you are, how compassionate you are, and how trusting as an individual you are. So try not to confuse it too much with conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is how trusted you can be, how reliable you are, and agreeableness is how trusting you are. Does that make sense? Conscientious is how you treat others. Agreeableness is how open you are to others. So like if you're agreeable, you're going to trust someone else. If you're conscientious, you will be trusted by others. Neuroticism is the measure of an individual's emotional stability. So someone who experiences a higher level of neuroticism will more often experience anxiety, negative emotions, and this emotional instability. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, cool. Didn't mess this one up, so we are going to do it. A person is overly worried about his friend being late to their party. He feels that if she is late, then the other guests will not want to stay. They will leave early and his night will be ruined. Based on this incident, this person would score. So I'll give you guys a minute, take a look. And polls are live. All right, take another few seconds, get your final answers in. Nice. Great job tonight, guys. Okay, so 9% said A, 82% said B, 9% said C, and nobody said anything else. So that is great because the answer is in fact high in neuroticism. So this person is overly worried, which that alone should just give it away that they would score very high in the neuroticism, emotional instability, anxiety, overthinking things. You're going to score high in neuroticism. Low in extroversion. would just mean someone is introverted. So if it was talking about how someone felt about their guests coming over, maybe something about them overstaying their welcome, we would think that that's correct, but that's not the case. High in conscientiousness. There's nothing really in the question that touches upon conscientiousness. And low in openness with 3 N's. Also, there's nothing that really touches upon that. And that was sort of like a distractor kind of thing. So this was a easier question than the ones from before, but just keep in mind that neuroticism is any of that emotional instability, negative emotion, anxiety, whenever that's present, and sometimes in an irrational amount, that indicates a high score in neuroticism. And that is all that I have for today. I was super concerned with getting all these slides in and putting information in, and I ranted through all of them. So that's all the content we have today. If you guys have any questions, I'll stick around a little bit and answer them. If not, have a great night. I hope you guys learned something. Just some parting thoughts. Psych and Soc, like I mentioned in the beginning, it's pretty much just straight content. You can utilize online sources all over to learn this stuff. There are thousands of videos on these topics that you can look up. You can look up on YouTube, use our videos. You can look everywhere for them. You can look up articles because you really just have to utilize multiple sources. And I think that's the best way to study this stuff because it really is just straight content. It's not really too abstract. So yeah, find the best way that you know how to study. Best way for me was definitely to look up videos, and there's a lot of really accurate resources out there.
Hey, Chris, quick question. How do you reconcile, for example, when a mother gives birth to a newborn and, the dad is a little bit sometimes feel left out because all the attention is to the newborn? Is that one of the Oedipal complexes, or where does that fit in?
Interesting. I'm sure you could probably fit it in. Yeah, because like we were talking about that phallic stage, and that's really where Freud was, really where he was convinced gender roles take precedent in personality formation. So, I mean, I'm not really sure if he mentioned much about how the father would feel, like the perspective from the father, but I'm sure that's definitely, if you were to write like an analysis of the father's perspective in that sort of instance, you could definitely touch upon the phallic stage. I would believe that that's probably how it would be categorized. So that's a pretty interesting question. Yeah. All right, so if you guys have no more questions, then we should be good to go. Keep a lookout. I will send the PowerPoint in the GroupMe, and you should see these videos uploaded to YouTube within the next couple of days. And just stay tuned. We'll have office hours on Sunday, and we'll have the rest of our lectures the previous couple of days at 8:30. You guys are all welcome. Have a great night, and we will talk to you soon. Tomorrow is, let me see. Oh, 1 second. There you go, Janelle got it. DNA, RNA, and proteins. No problem. All right. Have a great weekend, guys. Take care.